Are you ready? We're going to start with the pledge.
Sure.
No? Okay.
Oh, yeah, okay.
So Paul is going to bring up an appropriate, good. And Bill,
Okay.
you want to lead us in the pledge?
Yes. Can everyone please I'd like to welcome everyone, and we will now pledge allegiance to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, Bill.
Okay, I'd like to welcome everyone to tonight's community legislative meeting, Thursday, November 12th, 2020. We have an exciting meeting tonight, and I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Lutz.
So we had an exciting election. We have an exciting meeting. We have exciting post-election. So I am going to do my best with some help from Paul Tech Support to talk to you a little bit about what that might mean. Again, this is being recorded. And if we have teachers on who want to know which of their kids are on, email Kathy Maui and we'll get you that information. So the big question, what do the 2020 elections mean for public education, for us as a BOCES? Let's see what we can figure out at this point. Beep. All right, so voting. I know that Mr. Miller has been talking to us since we started this committee about the importance of voting. This is Loretta Lynch. She was a U.S. Attorney General. She says, voting is how we participate in a civic society, be it for president, be it for a municipal election. It's the way we teach our children in school elections how to be citizens and the importance of their vote. So we at this committee had elected officials come in at all different levels. We've had town officials come in, county officials come in, state officials come in. We have not had the privilege of having somebody, I don't believe, right, at the US level come in. But we know, right, that you can vote at all of those levels, and people have the opportunity to do that annually. And we had the opportunity to do that last week. So go ahead. So federal versus state elections in public education. So you probably have heard us say, if you've been on this committee before, that the federal government doesn't have much to do with education. But let's take a look at what really is behind that, right? So the civics and the history lessons that are required to understand exactly what the federal government's role in education are really kind of all tangled up together, right? So as with most things American, we start with the Constitution. What exactly does the Constitution say? So it's a document, as you know, that drives an awful lot of what happens, at least the laws in this country. It makes no mention of education. So apparently when they were writing it, education was not their first priority. They had a lot of other things to be thinking about at that time. But it does say in the 10th Amendment that the powers that are not delegated by the Constitution are reserved to the states. Okay, so because it's silent about education, there is an amendment there that says that makes the power for education a state authority, right? And it's often the state officials that we're talking to about public education, at least the funding of it. So go ahead, Paul. So how in the world do we have a U.S. Department of Education? And if they don't have anything to do with education, why do we have a cabinet level department of the United States government? So let me just tell you a little bit about that. So back in the 1860s, the first federal Department of Education under, believe it or not, President Andrew Johnson was established for the purpose of tracking education statistics. Who knew they even thought about education statistics back in the 1860s, but they did. But pretty quickly, they demoted that department to an office and then at some point did away with it. However, in the mid-1960s, the federal government took a more robust role in K-12 education. That's what we are here, K-12 education. And the reason for that was twofold. One was that the Supreme Court had ruled on Brown versus Board of Education at that time, which mandated a desegregation of public schools and gave the executive branch, or the president's branch, a legal precedent for enforcing equal access. Okay, so back in 1954, that was one of the reasons for it to become a federal interest, right? And at the same time, the Soviets were launching Sputnik, right? So that had this country and that country in all sorts of back and forth for years over who had better math and science education. So the Soviets were launching the satellite Sputnik, and there was a lot of anxiety that the nation's schools were falling behind. Some things never stopped being part of the conversation. So in 1965, those two things came together, and the Elementary and Secondary Education Act was a bill that was designed and by Francis Keppel, who was the Commissioner of Education at that time. So Commissioner of Education, right? Not the cabinet level position, but Commissioner of Education. And that bill was a key part of then President Johnson's war on poverty. But it is now a cabinet level department of the United States government. That started in May of 1984. And that was when Jimmy Carter, who signed an act to reorganize several of his cabinet level positions, and ended up with one just focused on education. So it began in 1980, has not been around all that long. Beep. We're seeing how well Paul listens. So it is a cabinet level position, which means we have a secretary, or Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos. So she was chosen by President Trump. She is one of the most controversial members of President Donald Trump's cabinet. So she was the only nominee. So when a president goes in, he gets to pick his cabinet, right? Or he gets to nominate his cabinet, and then other people kind of weigh in on what they think. She was the only nominee to receive 2 no votes from members of her own party, one from Maine, one from Alaska. And on the eve of her confirmation vote, the Democrats staged an all-night vigil in which they denounced her from the Senate floor. Following a 50-50 vote, so they voted and it was split 50-50, the Vice President, Mike Pence, so this is education for you. So when there is a tie in the Senate, the Vice President has the tie-breaking vote. And he broke the tie, and Betsy DeVos got the position, the first in the Senate's 228-year history of quote unquote, giving advice and consent. So that's the role of the Senate, not really to vet, but to give advice and consent to the presidential cabinet nominees. So you may not know why Betsy DeVos was so controversial, but the biggest thing is Betsy DeVos has no background in public education. Her background really is in Christian education and charter schools. And there is a bit of a divide in this country, and certainly in this state, on when it comes to charter schools and public education. So a lot of controversy about Secretary of Education DeVos, but she was President Trump's choice, and she has been our Secretary of Education since he became president. So when it comes to education, so we have this Secretary of Education. When it comes to education, the federal government is in charge of what? Like, what are they in charge of if they don't have a big role? So the federal government uses a pretty complex system of funding mechanisms, right? So who has the money usually gets to use their money, right, to, push some of their own priorities, right? So the federal government has funding mechanisms, policy directives, and a soft but considerable power of the presidential bully pulpit. In other words, that means when people are in control, they get to say what they think, and they get to influence people. So that's one of the reasons, or the main reasons really, how the United States Department of Education impacts public education by funding either what they choose to send or what they don't choose to send, or what kind of parameters they put on their money, and other kind of policy directives. It's not unlike them to put out policy memos And when you get a policy memo that comes from the United States Department of Education, you look at it and you think this must be important. It's coming from the federal government. But in reality, there is not much power behind those policy memos. But I will say that people pay attention to them. So next, one back. So what were people paying attention to? So, you know, educators love to teach about the elections, right? And especially when it's a presidential election year. So these were some things that people were wondering. Like, are young first-time voters going to make history with this election? Is this going to be a pivot point for federal education priorities, right? So in other words, new president is going to mean a new Secretary of Education. So are we going to be shifting some things that are federal education priorities? Some of that is going to have to do with charters and school choice. One of the things that Secretary DeVos has wanted to do is to take some of the money that is given to public schools and shift it to pay for parents to have more choice about where to send their kids. In other words, all right, if you want to choose a non-public school, let's put some money there to pay for those schools, which of course public educators have a lot of problem with, understandably. Civil rights, a lot of issues going on in this country related to civil rights, and they got all wrapped up in the election. Coronavirus response, for those of you paying attention, the present president has taken a lot of criticism for the way he has responded to the coronavirus. And then who is going to control Congress, right? We've learned enough in this committee to know that it's not just the executive branch, which of course at the federal level is the president, but at the state level, we know that, you know, we have a Democratic governor here, but whether or not the houses are Democrat or Republican really impacts what is able to happen. So who is going to control Congress, Democrats or Republicans? What's that going to mean for COVID-19 relief for schools and relief from the federal government? They're talking about money there, financial relief. And how will the effects of the coronavirus on schools shape state elections? So those were all the kinds of things that people were thinking about going into this election. So let's take a look at some of what happened. So first of all, this election was a very different election year. We had the coronavirus pandemic, and that caused more Americans than ever to cast their ballots ahead of Election Day. Right? We had early voting, as you can see there. We had lots of lines. There was early voting on Long Island. There were lines for early voting. That is not on Long Island, obviously, but a picture of people waiting in line to cast their vote. Now, to be to give some understanding, right? States control how and when they allow early voting and allow tabulation of those absentee ballots. Okay, so that is a state-controlled decision. For some reason, and probably people have some thoughts as to why that is, but the absentee ballots, those are the paper ballots that you could choose to request and mail them in instead of going to a polling place, either early or on Election Day, to cast your vote. And they were more likely to reflect votes for Democrats, causing delays in some key states. So what happens with those votes? They can go in before Election Day, but states also, some states will receive them as long as they're postmarked after Election Day. It's also a way for folks living in other countries or folks who are in the military to cast their votes. So absentee ballots for reasons were likely to reflect votes for Democrats. For those of you who paid a lot of attention to the kind of tracking the votes as they were coming in the presidential election, you know, over days that kind of shifted, because as the absentee ballots were counted, there were many more that came in voting Democratic than Republican. So certainly a delay in states causing or calling their votes for candidates, not only at the presidential level. So let's talk about New York elections. So up there, I took that off the New York State website on elections. So polls closed at 9 p.m. Mail-in ballots must be postmarked by November 3rd, received by November 10th. And mail ballot processing starts weeks before Election Day. So that's New York information. A little bit of information here. So as part of a 2019 justice agenda, this was pushed forward by Governor Cuomo, New York State instituted 8 days of early voting. So this year, 8 days, I believe it ended on the Sunday before Election Day. There were 8 days that people could go vote on, at limited polling places, not the same number as on Election Day, but in order to ease long lines on Election Day. This served a very important role in voting during the pandemic. Now, that's not why Governor Cuomo instituted that. He instituted it because he really thinks it's important for people to vote, and he wanted to give lots of opportunities in case people couldn't vote on Election Day. But this year, it served a really important purpose because, people who wanted to avoid long lines and crowds on Election Day could go early. The other thing that happened in 2020, New York State modified one of the reasons to utilize an absentee ballot. So absentee ballots were created for people who can't get to the polls, people like military folks, people who might be traveling overseas, people who might, for some reason, not going to be in town on Election Day. But this year, they added a reason to the list of reasons why you could request an absentee ballot, and it was unable to appear at the polls due to temporary or permanent illness or disability. And then in parentheses, it said, temporary illness includes being unable to appear due to risk of contracting or spreading a communicable disease like COVID-19. So they added that language, which again, I think had a lot of people who might have concerns choosing absentee ballots. It was very easy to get one. You could sign up online. They mailed it to your house. You filled it out, and then you were able to mail it in. So there were greatly increased numbers of absentee ballots. So federal level elections, electing a president in plain English. What does my vote really mean? What is the electoral college, and why do we use it? So there are people much better than me who are able to explain it. So we have found a video that's going to tell us a little bit about it, because votes in the presidential election are not quite as simple as they appear. You have to click on the electing a U.S. president in plain English.
Every 4 years, Americans who are 18 or older have a big responsibility. Our votes decide who becomes the President of the United States. Unfortunately, the U.S. election system isn't that simple. It's easy to imagine every U.S. citizen's vote being counted together on Election Day, but this is not the case. U.S. elections are not decided by the total or popular vote, but individual states. Let me explain. It starts with your vote. On Election Day, you'll vote for president and their vice president. You get one choice. Then, all the votes in your state are counted. The candidate with the most statewide votes becomes the candidate your state supports for president. This happens across the country until each state has selected their candidate. We end up with most of the 50 states and the District of Columbia voting to support one candidate each. But there's a problem. We can't elect a president by just counting up the choices of these states. U.S. states are different. Consider this. California has about 36 million people. Kansas has less than 3 million. We need a way for California's choice to have more influence on the election because the state has more people. The question becomes, how do we make sure each state has the right amount of influence on the election? Well, we need a way to account for the population of each state. As an example, let's consider my home state of North Carolina. Like every state, it is divided up into congressional districts that are based on population. North Carolina has 13 districts, California has 53, and Kansas has 4. When it comes to a state's influence on the election, the number of districts matters most. More population equals more districts equals more influence. The influence a state has in the election is measured by the number of electors. This number comes from the number of districts in a state plus the number of U.S. senators, which is always 2. North Carolina has 15 electors, while California has 55. When a candidate wins the voting in a state, They win that state's number of electors. That's why big, populous states can be so important to candidates. Their electors add up quickly, and the number of electors is what really matters. Here's why. If you add up the electors of all 50 states and the District of Columbia, there are 538 in total. The candidate's goal on Election Day is to win the majority of 538, or 270 electors. Once a candidate wins enough states to reach the 270 majority, they have won the election and become the president-elect. Yay! So, let's recap. Your vote helps your state choose a single candidate. That candidate receives all the electors from your state. The candidate who can win enough states to reach 270 total electors wins the national election and becomes the president-elect. Then, on the following January 20th, the president-elect is sworn in as the next president of the United States. And it all starts with your vote. Make it count.
Okay, so I see I have a question. So Michael wants to know, would we have to do this in person if no COVID? So that's a really good question, Michael. So that language on the absentee ballot was added this year. I don't know if that language is going to stay, but generally absentee ballots are used for people who cannot, for some reason, get to the polls, generally because they're not in town. Early voting is something that will stay unless the governor changes that, because that is law that he put into place in 2019. So at least it gives you a week plus. So there's 8 days of early voting plus election day. So, but that is a really good question. So let's take a look at let me first give you a little bit of history of the Electoral College, because if you're like me, you probably think, well, why are we not just counting all of the votes? Why do we have this other system that looks a little convoluted? So the history of that is way back when we didn't have the opportunity to communicate with each other instantaneously over fiber optics. What had to happen is people would get on a horse and they would actually go to the Capitol and get all of the information to vote. So it made sense for states to choose people that they trusted to go and listen to all of the information and vote on their behalf. So that's what it evolved out of. But it's still in place today. And some might say, do we still need it? Because certainly we're all able to get information about what's going on really across the world, the way we communicate. But that's where the Electoral College came from. The other thing, so you might wonder, well, do those people really go someplace and vote? And the honest answer is yes. In December, they all get together, all of those electoral. So it's not just a vote that a state has or a number of votes. There are actually people that go and represent that state at a meeting of all of the electors and cast their votes. And yes, there have been a couple of times in history when those electorates did not vote the way the state wanted them to vote, but it has never impacted an election. So let's take a look at what was happening on election night. So this was on election night. So I pulled this off of the Associated Press page. So at that point, it says on the top, the Associated Press had not called this race. In other words, they determined they did not have enough information to say that there were enough votes in to decide who was going to be the president-elect. But the question here is, what do red and blue states really mean? So you see a map of the country there. You see some states that are red, and you see some states that are blue, and then you see some states that are pink and some that are light blue. But let's take a look at what that really means. And let me just look, because Michael raised his hand. Does that mean you have a question? Oh, did the horses vote count? That's a good funny, Michael. I'm thinking the horses vote didn't count, but I'm guessing they were really important to get the people whose vote did count where they needed to be. So anyway, this is states. Some look red, some look blue. The dark ones mean that the Associated Press felt there were enough votes in those states to actually determine what the decision was for those states. But if we can go to the next slide and zoom in a little bit, right? So in looking at the country, Pennsylvania was light pink. But if we zoom in to Pennsylvania early on in the race, right? There was only 87% reporting at this point. It doesn't mean that the entire state was pink or red. So the pink or red means those are areas that are leaning Republican in their votes. But look there are parts of Pennsylvania that look blue, not a large part of the state, but certain important parts of Pennsylvania that were leaning Democrat, right? So Republican lead, but the whole state doesn't look red. So let's take a look at another state. Can you go back one? I think you missed one. Nevada. Right, so there is Nevada. Zooming in on Nevada, so if you look at the bottom of the Associated Press screen there, they at that point, the Democratic candidate was ahead with 49.3% of the vote. The Republican candidate, President Trump, had 48.7% of the vote. So the Democrats had a lead, but the whole state certainly doesn't look blue. Actually, the state looks more pink than it is blue. So when you look at a countrywide view, it doesn't really tell the story. So let's take a look at what did it look like in New York State. So that's New York State. At this point, the Associated Press had called the state. So the Associated Press, they have all sorts of things that they look at before they make a decision that they believe is statistically the right decision, right? With all of the different things they look at. So with 78% reporting in New York State, the Associated Press called the state for Joe Biden, the Democratic Party, but look at New York State. So there are certainly blue sections of New York State, but there are many sections of New York State that are red. So the overall state those electoral votes in New York State will go Democratic. The state was called, Joe Biden won New York State and won those electors. But if you look, certainly many parts of the state that sections of the state that voted Republican and whole sections of the state that won the majority Republican. Next slide. So at this point, the Associated Press and other news outlets have called the presidential race for Joe Biden. So that is their final, although you can see there are still states that are not fully decided: North Carolina, Georgia, Alaska. Joe Biden has almost 5 million more popular votes. By the way, one of the ways this election was different than any election prior is more people cast their votes than ever before. And actually, both candidates, Joe Biden and Donald Trump, received more votes for a presidential candidate than ever before. Joe Biden with 5 million more, almost 5 million more, obviously would be first, and Donald Trump is second, but both candidates received more votes than any before. And as you can see, we still have 3 states that are outstanding. I don't mean outstanding and that they're wonderful. I mean outstanding and that they have not yet fully determined who is getting their electoral votes. But if you look at the top of that slide, you know that with 290 electoral votes, Joe Biden has reached more than the 270 that he needed to win the Electoral College. Next slide. So as we know, it's not just about the president, and it's not just about that election. So there were other key federal races that were up. The US Congress has 435 seats up for election, or had 435 seats up for election. And if you look at the bottom there, you can see the Associated Press has not called all 435 at this point. I think the last time I checked might have been on Monday. But the Democratic Party at this point has 205 seats. They are 5 down. So the Democratic Party lost 5 congressional seats. That's countrywide. The Republican Party has gained 6 congressional seats. So we have to stop and think, what does that mean for a Democratic president, right? We've heard it's easier for a president or a governor to move their agenda along if they have majorities in the houses to help them do that, because in many things you need the support of the Congress, the Senate, as well as the president. So certainly some key things going on in other federal races. Next slide. So let's take a look at Senate races. All right, so not every state had Senate races this year. You can see the ones that are blue had, the ones that are dark blue and dark red had races and have determined based on their counting of ballots who won in those states. The Republican Party at this point had 48 total seats. They are down 1. The Democratic Party had 46, which is up 1. So very, very close, right? So and the best way to be able to move things forward in the Senate is to have a majority of Senate seats consistent with the president. So if we had a Democratic president, a majority of seats is going to make it easier for that president to move his agenda along. And when you have a tie, 50-50, just like with the Secretary of Education, the vice president is that tiebreaker. But a couple of things in there, as you see, there are states that have not determined yet. So North Carolina hasn't determined yet. Alaska hasn't determined yet. And Georgia has this really funny hash like mark on it. And that's because Georgia has 2 contested seats. They are going to go for a revote in January. So there are 2 seats there. But there is still enough information or outstanding information that we don't quite know what's going to happen with the Senate and those seats. They're pretty close, but people are still watching because the majority party in the Senate makes a big difference for a president being able to get things done. Next slide. What about congressional races in New York State? So if we want to look carefully at New York State, you can see there again, New York has, we had 27 seats up for election. At this point, the Associated Press had called 19 of them, right? So 19 of those states, they felt that statistically there were enough votes in that it was going to be either red or blue. So you can see the dark red and the dark blue. You see Long Island right there under the word city in New York City has not yet been called. That's our territory, and that is because Long Island, certainly in that congressional seat, has been a Lee Zeldin seat for the last couple of years, and that race has not yet been called. And some of that is because the absentee ballots have not yet been fully counted. And what did we learn? That absentee ballots, the ones that they counted for president, many of them were Democratic, and it's possible that the ones that voted absentee for congressional races may also lean in one direction or the other. But this is the other thing. Remember, we looked at New York State when we looked at presidential votes, and we realized even though the state as a whole was a blue state, a Democratic state, it certainly didn't look that way when you leaned in to see how people actually voted. And it's the same way for Congress, right? You see blue around the cities, Buffalo, Rochester, Albany, New York City. You see at this point leaning blue between Albany and New York City, but you see much of the rest of the state either Republican in the way they voted for their congressional members or leaning Republican. So again, it doesn't look as even as it does when you zoom out and is when you zoom in and actually take a look at the details. So next, what are the New York unknowns? So one thing, New York does not allow absentee ballots to be opened until after Election Day. So they didn't start looking at them until after last Tuesday. The ballots do have to be postmarked, but not received by election day. So because we know it sometimes takes time for them to get there, boards of election have until November 10th to accept postmarked absentee ballots. So they had until this past Tuesday. If they were sent domestically, that means if they were sent within this country, but they have until November 16th for overseas and military ballots. So there may still be ballots that are in the mail and on the way, and the Board of Elections will accept them until November 16th. Local boards must report their election results to the state by November 28th. So Suffolk County has its own Board of Elections. And if you go on the Suffolk County website, you can click on, there's a link there to see results of elections, and it will tell you statewide, well, for federal and state and local elections, how people voted. So Suffolk County has until November 28th to do all of its processing and report officially what the election results were in this county. So if you're paying attention to the news, which I know that you all are, that's why you do things like come to a legislative committee meeting. You know that there's been some federal legal challenges that have already been filed in some states, not in New York at the moment. Some of the state legislative races may be close enough to go to recounts. So that's something that will take time. Maybe none of these things will happen, but it will likely be weeks before we know official results. So let's take a look at unofficial results. So some of these people we may know, right? Because we've invited elected officials to come and speak to us. So this is Long Island unofficial results for US Congress. So in other words, how did Long Island make determinations of who they were going to send to Albany, or excuse me, to Washington to represent us? As I said, District 1, which is a very large part of Long Island, Lee Zeldin, who is a Republican, he is the incumbent, meaning he has that seat now. It is leaning Republican in those votes, but again, it has not been called. So Andrew Garbarino, who was, up until this time, was actually a state elected official. He is Republican. It is leaning in his direction. So Andrew Garbarino actually ran for the seat that was Peter King's seat. So Peter King, longtime congressional representative of Long Island, he retired, so that seat was open. And it was a Republican seat when Peter King had it, but Andrew, and again, it's leaning Republican. He would be new as a representative of Long Island, but certainly not new to politics. And then we have District 3, George A.D. Santos, who is Republican and is new, and this is a flip. So that was prior to this a Democratic seat, and actually it was held by Congressman Swazi, who's been around in politics a long time, and I venture to say is quite surprised that seat is at the moment, again, we're still waiting for ballots, is Republican. But that would give all of Long Island's congressional representation in Washington to the Republican Party. So next, Suffolk County unofficial New York State Senate results as of November 7th. So why is this important to us? It's important to us because these are the folks that have probably the most direct influence on the money that comes to public education, right? Public education is funded only about 3% from Washington. So although they can use their money to get states to do what they want, and every once in a while they throw extra money in to get states to do what they want, the bulk of money for school districts comes from taxpayers, as well as aid from New York State aid to schools. And it is our state level officials that have the most direct impact on how much that money is. So let's take a look. Some of these folks we know, or at least we know of the districts. So District 1, which was Ken LaValle's district. So we had Ken LaValle, he kicked off our legislative committee meetings this year. He is retiring at the end of December. So of course he did not run. Anthony Palumbo, who is a Republican, Ken LaBelle was a Republican, is looking like the winner for that seat. He will be new to that seat. However, Anthony Palumbo was an assembly person. So he represented as a Republican, the assembly district a little bit east, kind of North Fork of Long Island. Then we have Mario Matera, who is a Republican, Senate District number 2. He is new. We have Senate District number 3, Alexis Week. Alexis is a Republican. She is new, and that is a flip. Senate District 3 is Monica Martinez's district. So you may remember we had Senator Martinez in to talk to us at this committee. She was Democratic. That at the moment, again, these are unofficial results. That District 3 is leaning Republican. Again, that is new. It would be a new senator, and that is a flip. We have Phil Boyle, who we have heard a couple of times on this committee, longtime state senator in District 4. Phil is Republican, and it is leaning towards Phil Boyle. Senate District 5, Edmund J. Smythe. He is Republican. That is a flip. That means that was a Democratic seat. But at the moment, Edmund J. Smythe is ahead. So that would flip from Democratic to Republican if the vote stays that way. And then we have John Brooks, who is a Democrat and is winning. And he ran unopposed. Actually, they might have even called that race. So there was no opponent to John Brooks. He's a big supporter of public education. But we know what needs to happen for folks to be able to get legislation across the line is you need to be in the majority party. Last year we had, or the year before, I don't remember, we had a lot of shifts to Democratic seats. The Republicans lost the majority in the state Senate for the first time in quite a while, and actually lost lots of seats. So there was a huge difference in the number of Democratic seats versus Republican. So those are unofficial Senate results as of November 7th. Let's flip to the next slide. Suffolk County unofficial New York State Assembly results. So these are the Assembly members. We have Fred Thiel, who we have heard at this committee as well. Fred represents the East End, technically calls himself independent, but many of the votes that he got, I was going to say were Democratic, but I take that back. So Fred Thiel, way ahead in that vote. We have Jody Giglio, is Republican. She would be new to that position. She actually ran for where Anthony Palumbo was. He's the one who ran in Ken LaBelle's seat. Joe DiStefano, presently Republican, and it's leaning towards him again. Michael S. Ross, who is Republican, he would be new. That's a flip. That was a Democratic seat. Doug Smith, who I know this committee loves. Doug has come and spoken to us a couple of times. Doug is Republican and looking like he is the winner. We have Phil Ramos, who, so look there, right? That just shows the kind of support that Phil Ramos gets from his community. He is a Democrat at this point amongst a Republican field, and he is ahead in the vote. And then we've got Jarrett Gandolfo and Michael Fitzpatrick. Jarrett is new, is a Republican. That's not a flip, it was a Republican seat. And Michael Fitzpatrick, who we all know as the one who thinks that schools should spend less money. And he's pretty consistent in that message that he tells us every year at Longwood. So where does that leave us? Where are we? Assuming we know what we know, right? Which means assuming that what is not officially called is actually what's going to happen. One thing, we are more divided as a country in all states than we are united, right? Even the states that look red and blue, when you zoom in, there's lots of blue and there's lots of red. So we have a lot of division going on in this country. We also know it takes unified effort to make change, right? We've had elected officials come and tell us how important it is to be able to work with their colleagues across the aisle, to work unified and to do the best thing. When they talk to us, they're talking about doing the best thing for public education, but we know that it takes unified effort to make change. We know at this point that Joe Biden, as the assumed president-elect with 290 electoral votes, that he has the most experience in public service in US history. So he has served in public service more than any other president. He is the oldest man to assume the presidency, which that probably goes in line with the first bullet. And also this, like he takes on those duties amid a historic crisis, a pandemic that has already claimed more American lives than World War I, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War combined, and has produced the highest unemployment rates since the Great Depression. So he is not walking into a piece of cake. He is walking into a lot of work and a lot of challenges that needs to be addressed. So our last slide, assumptions and questions. So education policy will likely change with the new Secretary of Education. So with the new president, we will get a new Secretary of Education. For those of you who listened to his first speech after he was announced as the president-elect, he happens to have a wife who is a teacher and only one of two first ladies that intends to continue to work. So he is, at least he speaks that he is a supporter of public education. So we have to take a look at what's going to happen with charter schools, what's going to happen with 3 through 8 testing. So Secretary DeVos said that she didn't really care if we were in the middle of a pandemic. 3 through 8 testing was going to happen this year. Last year, there was flexibility and it was waived. And we're still in the middle of a pandemic, so we'll see what happens with that. We'll see what will happen with federal title money. Title money is the money that the federal government gives out to districts with students with certain specific types of needs. There's, different levels of title money for different purposes. So lots to see what's going to happen if we have or when we have a new Secretary of Education. We also question, federal money is needed in New York schools and across the nation to support the efforts that are needed to keep schools open. It has not been able to be moved pre-election. There's been lots of conversation about it. But moving up to the election, there were lots of other things that elected officials were busy thinking about. So a question is, will the new leadership be able to make that happen? Is that something that's going to be able to be decided with Democrats and Republicans in support of that? Will there be a shift in the response to the coronavirus? When will that be? What will that be? And will President-elect Joe Biden be able to draw on his relationships to move actions and decisions across party lines? So one of the benefits of being around so long is you have a lot of friends. Whether or not they're still friends when somebody becomes president, we'll wait to see, and whether or not friends are friends that are willing to work together and put aside party politics. Lots of things to wonder and questions to wait and see them answered. And the other is, will shifts in the party in New York State legislators impact state actions? So with shifts towards more Republicans in our state level houses, is that going to impact New York State and how it responds to public education? So that is the presentation. Happy to try to answer any questions that people might have. Looking at, let's see. Yeah, so Mrs. Romano from our board put a link in the chat, a place that illustrates the votes by area instead of land mass. So if those of you want to see it. And I know that one of the speakers we had come in, it might have even been, no, it was last year, this calendar year, last school year, came in and talked to us about the census, right? And the importance of the census and the importance of having everybody count. Well, the reason we want everybody to count is, guess what? The more people in New York State, the more representation we have. And the more representation we have, the more electors we have when it comes to presidential elections. But happy to answer any other questions. If people have them, feel free to put them in the Q&A. So not a lot of chat shares. April is telling me you guys aren't able to see them. But the questions I've addressed. So if there's any other questions, I'm happy to answer them. Otherwise, we are getting quite close to 8. So I thank you for your attention. Thank you for your interest. For those of you who went out and voted, thank you for using that privilege and having your voice heard. Wait, we have one new message. Okay. So question, doesn't the state turn red or blue depending on who the large cities vote for? So that's a really interesting thought. So cities tend to have a lot of people, right? So when you looked at some of those states, right, where most of the, well, like New York, right, much geographically, most of New York State looked red, but New York State in the presidential election went blue. And that is because the urban centers, the city centers, where they happen to have more people, so more people actually voted Democratic for president. So the state ends up being a Democratic state. So doesn't always happen that way, because honestly, if you went across and you looked at states, and those maps are online, you could go to the Associated Press site and look at them. In most urban centers in this country, the vote was Democrat. It just matters how many people there are in the other parts of the state. So, but again, thank you for your attention. Bill, I don't know if you have any closing comments. You have to unmute.
Okay. I guess if there's no more questions, we'll end the meeting, but there's some upcoming events. Longwood School District's virtual 16th Regional Legislative Breakfast, co-sponsored by Eastern Suffolk BOCES and Suffolk Region PTA, Saturday, February 6, 2020. Guess we'll have to put that on the calendar.
Yeah.
And in closing, I just like for the students, as you become young adults, you have the empowerment. So just use your right to vote and you can make a change.
Yeah, let me just thank you. It's absolutely important. And Ariana just asked, isn't Donald Trump still president until inauguration? Absolutely. And so this is the time, right? Sometimes if a president is changing over, sometimes they call this like lame duck president time, because it's difficult for a president who is going to leave office on January 20th, that's inauguration day, sometimes difficult for that individual to make things happen. It's not impossible, but yes, the president is president until the inauguration of the next president, which happens on January 20th. Students can still participate in the legislative breakfast, yes. And it is going to be virtual this year. One of the pluses of that, believe it or not, is we can fit more people on a Zoom webinar than we can in the Longwood Middle School, whatever you call that space, cafeteria?
Cafeteria.
But yes, it is going to be virtual and students can still participate. So we will figure out how to get names of students who are interested in doing that.
Okay.
All right. Thank you all. Have a great evening.
Thank you again.